May the words of my mouth and the meditations of our hearts be always acceptable in thy sight, O Lord, our strength and our Redeemer. Woody Guthrie was a folk singer, active in the 30s and 40s. He wrote, This Land Is Your Land. And he came to define the popular image of a folk singer as a kind of ragamuffin, someone simple in speech but politically thoughtful, shrouded in myths about hopping trains and traveling all over the country and somehow capturing the voice of the common people of a given generation. He embodied a collection of imagery and ideas that would find reinterpretation and expression again and again in subsequent generations of musicians, especially Bob Dylan, whose earliest career was a frank Woody Guthrie imitation in all aspects. Woody Guthrie's influence was so immense that the banjo player and folk singer Pete Seeger, who was a contemporary of Woody Guthrie's and who was active himself, playing right up till his death in 2014, Pete Seeger said that all of us, his generation and later folk singers, all of us were Woody's children. Peter, here in our passage from chapter 4 and elsewhere in his letter, as we've seen, imagines that the Christian's life is patterned on the life of Christ. That the life of every Christian is inspired by and gives expression to Christ's own life. Something like that is what the word Christian means. And it's interesting that we see that word here in verse 16 because it's actually not a common biblical word. This is only the third and final time this word appears in the New Testament. The first is Acts 11:26, after Barnabas has brought Saul/Paul, to Antioch. They teach for a year, and it's there that the disciples are first called Christians. The second is in Acts 26:28. Herod tells Paul, "You would presume to persuade me to become a Christian?" The word Christ is, in the New Testament, only beginning to function like a proper name, the way that we normally use it. Really, it's a title, which translates the Hebrew word for Messiah, and which means, like that word, anointed. So it also refers, the word Christ, by extension to Jesus' kingship. Right, in the biblical world, kings are anointed. So, to get a little technical for just a little bit, the word Christian in English and in Greek combines that Greek word with a Latin suffix that expresses the idea that the people or things referred to with this suffix belong to the person whose name the suffix is attached to. So you would see slaves given names which were their master's name with Ionos attached. So when the followers of Christ are called Christianos, it means they belong to him. And it's even been suggested that the term was originally coined as an insult. Ancient Antioch apparently had a reputation for coining pejorative nicknames. And the word Christian in Greek sort of parodies the Greek word used to refer to those who worshipped or were subject to Caesar. And if that's true, if it were originally an insult that the early Christians embraced, that makes good sense of verse 16. In a world where even being called a Christian could be a source of shame, Peter says specifically that they should not be ashamed. Christians belong to Christ. And we can see that Peter is making the larger point that those who belong to Christ are also to become like him. So just glancing through here, our passage beginning at verse 13, going even into chapter 5, Peter assumes that we'll be like Christ in our suffering, like him in our trust of God, like him in whatever role in the church that we have. He'll say that elders in the church should be like Christ in their leadership, that the young are to be like Christ in their humility. We're to be like him in resisting evil. And ultimately, looking all the way ahead to chapter 5, verse 10 here, we're to be like him in being glorified, restored, confirmed, strengthened, and established by God. I think of that big parachute thing we use for games at VBS. We've started to plan our virtual VBS for this year, so I've kind of got that on the brain. And you'll know what I mean if you ever did this at school. Everybody stands around this big circular parachute thing, handles all around the outside, and you put balls or whatever on it and bounce them. But you got to kind of work together for it to work. And then when you're done, you'll lay it out because you got to fold it up later. But sometimes somebody will grab hold of it and take off walking. And when they do, then you'll see all of the handles and all of the colors and whatever stuff is on there converge to a point, pulled into one direction. And something like that is the picture here, I think, that in our lives, in all of their disparate aspects, all our affections, all of our desires, our inclinations, our pursuits, they should all converge Christward. And to think in terms of a community, as we all head toward Christ, we'll find that we are brought closer together as well. One more way to think of this is that this passage is that in the same way that God, throughout the Old Testament, especially as the children of Israel are nearing the promised land, God is said to go before his people and lead them into where he's gone ahead of them. So Christ, as we find expressed in the book of Hebrews, goes ahead of us and leads us where he has already gone. All of the things that Peter mentions as characterizing the Christian life are things that Christ has already done. These are places he's already been and in which he has been victorious. So to glance back again through the passage and looking ahead again through chapter 5, he has suffered and not been ashamed, but glorified God. He shepherded his flock. He clothed himself with humility. He was humbled, humiliated, that at the proper time he might be exalted. He resisted the devil, and after suffering a little while, the God of all grace, who had called him to eternal glory, himself restored, confirmed, strengthened, and established him. And what is true of Christ will be true of us. So may we, not just in our suffering, but in our whole lives, pattern ourselves on Christ, entrusting our souls to our faithful Creator while doing good. May we know that we belong to Him, that we are all His children.